Politics is next.
This is Pacifica Radio's Letters on Politics. On today's show.
And he knew that the United States going to war would set back all of these causes tremendously. He spoke about this very eloquently, watching one after another of his fellow senators leave the floor as he did so. People began sending him nooses in the mail. He was hanged in effigy on the campus of the University of Wisconsin, his alma mater, and he really had a rough time. The Senate actually opened an investigation into whether he should be expelled from that body entirely.
In 1917, progressive Senator Robert La Follette tried to keep the United States from getting involved in World War I. The backlash was severe, as it was for all of those who opposed the war. Today we'll be in conversation about this history. Our guest is Adam Hochschild. He is the author of the book, American Midnight, The Great War, A Violent Peace, and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis. That's next on Letters on Politics. But first, the news.
For Pacifica Radio, I'm Christina Onnested. An overnight drone strike near the Ukrainian port of Odessa has sparked a massive fire and explosion. The airstrike was the latest in a series of drone attacks on the key southern city in recent days. It hit a military installation and detonated ammunition when it struck. Firefighters were struggling to contain the blaze, according to Ukraine's military. The strike came just hours after the U.S. vowed to take decisive action and promised catastrophic consequences if Russia uses nuclear weapons in Ukraine, a threat implied by President Vladimir Putin last week. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan spoke to ABC's This Week.
We have communicated directly, privately, to the Russians at very high levels that there will be catastrophic consequences for Russia if they use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. We have been clear with them and emphatic with them that the United States will respond decisively alongside our allies and partners, and we have protected those communications, which we have done privately to the Russians, but they well understand what they would face if they went down that dark road.
Voting continues in the Russian-annexed parts of Ukraine, whether to join Russia, Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and parts of Zaporizhia. Tomorrow is the last day of voting. Ukrainian officials say many residents have fled the regions before the referendums got underway. There are also reports of Russian officials bringing in busloads of people with armed guards to vote in what Ukraine and the West call a proxy sham election. In Russia, protests continue against the draft, and now a shootout has occurred at a Siberian draft office in opposition to it. The person is reportedly in custody. Thousands have been arrested protesting the war in Ukraine, more than 1,000 over the weekend, according to the group OVD Info. Also in Russia, a mass shooting at a school has killed 15 and wounded 24 others in the city of Ivesht, about 600 miles east of Moscow. Officials say 11 children are among the dead. 22 of the wounded are also children. The Fascist Brothers of Italy party has won the most votes in Italy's national election. The party has its roots in the post-World War II neo-fascist Italian social movement. Giorgia Meloni has taken the Brothers of Italy from a fringe far-right group to its biggest party. She spoke. Her comments were translated by Al Jazeera.
When this night is over, we will remember that this is a new beginning. From tomorrow on, we will have to show what our values are worth. If we are called to govern and lead this nation, we will do it for every single Italian with the goal to unite these people. Because our biggest goal in life is to make sure that Italians are finally proud again, to fly our flag high.
The party won a quarter of the vote and now controls both houses in Italy. Meloni stands to be the nation's first female premier. Today marks the 8th anniversary of 43 missing students at a leftist college in Mexico's Guerrero state. Protests are planned across Mexico. A report last month by Mexico's new presidency found the disappearances a state crime involvement. This month, Mexican authorities arrested a retired general and 3 other members of the army in connection to the disappearances. Forecasters say Hurricane Ian is nearing Cuba, on track to strike Florida as a Category 4 storm as early as Wednesday. Ian's already getting stronger and is forecast to move over Cuba's western province today. Forecasters have issued a hurricane watch for the Tampa Bay area. Pakistan's massive floods have wiped out large swaths of crops and forcing the country to fear for significant food shortages. The reason for concern is that wheat planting season is fast approaching, but vast areas that would normally be planted with wheat are still underwater. In the U.S., the Biden administration is using the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to investigate environmental discrimination by state agencies and others that receive federal funds. Experts say it's a seismic shift to use the civil rights law to go after environmental discrimination. In one example, the EPA has agreed to investigate allegations that Louisiana officials discriminated against black residents by failing to control air pollution in parishes packed with refineries and petrochemical plants, a region some call Cancer Alley. The Reverend William Barber joined EPA Administrator Michael Reagan Saturday to launch the Office of Environmental Justice.
And it doesn't matter where you're in Cancer Alley in Louisiana, where I've been there fighting, or down in Alabama, where a woman said that she had so much sewage in her front yard that the only thing that she didn't have contaminating her was HIV/AIDS, and she wasn't sure that that also wasn't in the sewage. Or whether it's down in Duplin County, a chicken plant trying to put a manure burning factory, you get airborne arsenic. Once it goes up, it doesn't stay in the black community. It goes all over.
That's the Reverend William Barber. The effort is part of the Biden administration's promise to prioritize environmental justice enforcement in communities overburdened by pollution. Protests continue in Iran demanding justice for the slain woman who died while in custody of the nation's morality police for not wearing her headscarf properly. Mass protests across the country have spread to Iranian embassies and major cities around the globe over the weekend. Iranian state TV reports at least 41 protesters and police have been killed in the country since the protest began a week and a half ago. The Associated Press count is reporting at least 13 dead, with more than 1,200 protesters arrested. And this just in, President Vladimir Putin of Russia has granted Russian citizenship to former U.S. security contractor and whistleblower Edward Snowden. I'm Christina Onnested, reporting for Pacifica Radio.
Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. It was a time of great political strife. It was a time of war, a time of a pandemic, a time of extreme anti-immigrant sentiment, and a time of vigilantism. And it was also a time that my guest today argues was an extreme threat to American democracy. My guest is Adam Hochschild. Adam Hochschild is the author of the new book called American Midnight, The Great War, A Violent Peace, and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis. Adam Hochschild, it is a great pleasure to welcome you back to this radio program.
Well, thank you, Mitch. It's always fun talking with you.
American Midnight focuses on the Great War years. We say Great War, meaning World War I. And it's fascinating because in 1916, President Woodrow Wilson, well, he is president during this time. In 1916, he runs for re-election on a platform of keeping the United States out of the war, but he would end up being the person most principal for getting the United States into the war. He does this on April 2nd, 1917, an address to a joint session of Congress when he called for a declaration of war against Germany. Of course, we don't have recordings of this speech like we would in later years, but it's a very dramatic moment, and it's a moment that you detail in your book. Can you talk to me about this day, April 2nd, 1917, and this address to a joint session of Congress?
But this was a key day, April 2nd, 1917. And because the focus that day is on President Woodrow Wilson, you know everything the president was doing minute by minute through the day, because his widow wrote a book, his doctor wrote a book, his chief of staff wrote a book, everybody around him, recorded it. And here's why it was so crucial. Up until that point, the United States had not been part of the First World War. This terrible war, the worst that history had yet seen, had been going on in Europe for almost 3 years. The US had been selling munitions and making a great deal of profit to selling munitions to the Allies, but it hadn't been part of the war. The time came when Wilson wanted to join that struggle. And he went to Congress on April 2nd and asked Congress to declare war. And as the day goes on during this first chapter of mine, you can see the tensions on both sides. The streets of Washington were filled with, on the one side, pacifists who were hoping desperately that the US would stay out of this tremendous slaughterhouse that was going on in Europe. And at the same time, fervent super patriots waving flags, demanding that we go off and fight. And how could we possibly want to miss being in the largest war that the world had ever seen? So Wilson gave this speech before Congress, and he was a great orator with a golden voice. The thing that struck me is that the moment it became clear that he was calling for a full declaration of war and for the United States to raise an enormous army and to send it to Europe, it was like it took the cork out of a bottle of boiling super patriotism that was just looking for a target for joy. There was one point in his speech one sentence where it suddenly became clear he was not asking just that the United States join the war and start sinking German submarines. People thought he might limit his request to Congress to that, but he actually wanted to raise an army of hundreds of thousands of men and send it to Europe. At that moment, leading the cheering was the Chief Justice of the United States, who leapt to his feet, Edward White of Louisiana, literally weeping tears of joy, leading this thunderous ovation at the prospect that the United States was going to join this incredible slaughterhouse going on in Europe. Now, why should the Chief Justice, who was incidentally a veteran of the Confederate Army, why should he be weeping tears of joy at this great prospect? I'm not sure, but it was typical of the kind of frenzy that spread throughout the country. And the first reflections of this frenzy was that anybody or anything with a connection to Germany immediately got condemned. Many states passed laws against speaking German in public. All over the country, there were bonfires of German books removed from schools and libraries. People with German names changed them. That was when the Frankfurter became the hot dog. The hamburger became, I think, Salisbury steak. So there is this potential for super patriotism, mindless super patriotism that is always hovering there under the surface in this country. And I find it particularly striking at this moment, 1917, because the United States had not been attacked. German submarines had sunk some American ships, but these were ships carrying munitions to the Allies, transiting war zones in the ocean, which the Germans had warned any ship carrying munitions going through this area is going to be sunk. So the US really didn't have a valid grievance against Germany, but still there was that desire to be at war with somebody that was so manifest on that particular day.
I always remember the first time I saw the movie Reds, starring Warren Beatty as John Reed, who wrote the book 10 Days That Shook the World, about his observations of the Russian Revolution. And I remember in the movie, this is the first time I heard this argument, John Reed, through Warren Beatty, the actor, making the argument that the war was for financial reasons. And that was the first time I had ever heard that. I was younger then when I saw that movie. But that was the first time I ever heard that argument. You lay out this argument about the financial aspects and motivations in getting into the war.
I think it's really true. One thing that had happened just shortly before Wilson gave that speech was that the American ambassador in London had cabled Washington saying, Britain and France are running out of money to pay us. They were buying a huge proportion of their military supplies in the US. Britain, I believe, was spending something like 40% of its military budget in the United States because American factories were turning out artillery shells, guns, submarine parts that were then assembled into submarines in Canada, all kinds of other things, and huge quantities of raw material, steel, explosives, and everything else were being manufactured here. But Britain and France had been at war for nearly 3 years. They had lost vast numbers of men. Parts of France had been turned into a wasteland. And the American ambassador in London warned Wilson and his cabinet that they're running out of money. And the only way they're going to survive is if we can advance them loans and credits. And this, it was felt, was hard to do unless the United States was actually in the war. So I think there was a strong financial reason for the United States to join the war, which was that Americans who had bought British, French, and Russian war bonds thought they might not be paid back unless the Allies won the war. Companies that were trying to collect debts for war supplies they had sold to Britain and France also were afraid they wouldn't be paid back. But with the US in the war, then all kinds of credits and loans could be advanced to the Allied countries. And of course, the people who bought the Tsarist war bonds never were paid back.
Again, Woodrow Wilson gives this address to a joint session of Congress on April 2nd, 1917, asking for a declaration of war against Germany. This is 6 months since he won his re-election bid, in which he ran on a platform to stay out of the war. Can you talk to me about the debate that would ensue afterwards, after this address in 1917 to Congress, the debate in Congress over this declaration of war, and principally tell me about Republican Senator Robert La Follette?
Well, one of the notable things about this period was that there was a sizable proportion of the American population that did not want to go to war for a mixture of motives. Some people were of German descent and felt some loyalty to Germany. The left as a whole, the 6% of the American population who had voted for Eugene Debs for president in the popular vote in 1912, and many people in other groups felt, this was a war between capitalist powers, and the workers of the world should be fighting the capitalists and not each other. And other people as well, not necessarily on the left, felt, this was a quarrel among rival European empires, and the US should stay out of it. When things came to a vote, should the United States declare war, 6 members of the Senate, which was then 96 people, because we didn't yet have Hawaii and Alaska as states. 6 members of the Senate voted no, and 50 members of the House of Representatives voted no. In the Senate, the most outspoken person was Robert La Follette, Republican of Wisconsin. One of the curious things about this period is that the divide between right and left on the war and on many other issues as well cut across party lines. So those 6 senators and 50 representatives came from both parties. Robert La Follette was the leader of the progressive forces in the Senate, Republican from Wisconsin, a very good guy who had fought all his life for the rights of labor, of minorities, of women, fought to regulate big business. He was not a socialist, but he believed that the power of big business ought to be restrained and highly regulated. He was in favor of all kinds of social welfare legislation. And he knew that the United States going to war would set back all of these causes tremendously. He spoke about this very eloquently. watching one after another of his fellow senators leave the floor as he did so. People began sending him nooses in the mail. He was hanged in effigy on the campus of the University of Wisconsin, his alma mater. All but two of that university's faculty signed a statement condemning him. He was kicked out of a club he belonged to in Madison, Wisconsin, the state's capital. And he really had a rough time. The Senate actually opened an investigation into whether he should be expelled from that body entirely. It was an extremely rough time for him, as it was for many anti-war dissidents. Incidentally, by a couple of years after the war was over, popular feeling in this country changed, and millions of people realized it had been a mistake to join that war, and La Follette was reelected.
You're right that this period of time is on a quote on a scale never seen before. The American military would now be spying on American civilians.
Yeah, this happened as soon as the war began. There was a guy who's one of the characters in the book. I like to tell a story like this through focusing on 8 or 10 characters in a particular period. And some of them are obvious people that everybody knows. Woodrow Wilson, who was president, Theodore Roosevelt, who was no longer president, but certainly wanted to be and was desperate to find a role for himself in the war. Other people are less known, one of them being an Army officer named Ralph Van Diemen, then a lieutenant colonel. Van Diemen was an intelligence officer who had honed his skills of surveillance by monitoring rebels in the Philippines, where the U.S. had fought a very brutal war from 1899 into the early 1900s against Filipinos wanting independence from American rule. And Van Diemen had developed a card file system to keep track of Filipino subversives. And as soon as the U.S. went to war in 1917, he went to the Secretary of War and said, we need to watch subversives in this country. And he got the go-ahead to start a military intelligence division inside the War Department, which had nothing to do with watching the Germans. They figured the British and French were way ahead of them on that score in Europe, but rather watching subversive forces in the United States. So they were spying on labor unionists, they were spying on wobblies, the members of the Industrial Workers of the World, they were spying on socialists, they were spying on Christian pacifists. And of course, one of the enjoyable things about writing about all this 100 years later is that you can see their records. They're in the National Archives, which have been back again in the news recently. You can see the reports that Van Diemen's spies sent him from these different organizations. And it was a huge operation. Within a year, he had more than 1,000 people working for him, military and civilian, all of them spying on pacifists and left-wingers of one sort or another inside the United States.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with Adam Hochschild. Adam Hochschild is the author of the new book, American Midnight, The Great War, A Violent Peace, and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis. It is what we are in conversation about. Tell me about Leo Wendell.
Okay, he's one of my favorite characters in the book. In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, big industrial town, the Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies, the country's most militant labor union, were eager to organize. And in 1917, a new Wobbly arrived in Pittsburgh, and he was quite quickly elected secretary of the local Wobbly branch. And for the next 3 years, he led marches and demonstrations. He fired up his comrades with patriotic speeches. He loyally joined every conceivable left-wing organization in town. He was on the strike committee for a big strike of steelworkers. He supported the Socialist Party. He was active in the Radical Library, and always urging the most militant course of action. And the entire time, He was the star undercover agent of the Department of Justice, specifically the Bureau of Investigation, which added federal to its name some years later. And again, thanks to the National Archives, you can see the reports that Leo Wendell made, sometimes on almost a daily basis, of the doings of the left in Pittsburgh. Fascinating guy, joyfully reported his successful attempts to cause divisions in various groups. And he played this role to the hilt. For example, at one point, there was a strike of streetcar drivers and ticket takers in Pittsburgh. And to break it, the authorities brought in strike breakers, streetcar drivers from New York and Philadelphia. And Wendell led a couple of wobblies into attacking a streetcar driven by strike breakers, and proudly reported to the Bureau of Investigation that they had beaten the driver and the ticket taker unconscious with a metal bar, the kind of bar that you use to adjust switches on a track. So obviously, the Justice Department had told him to go in there and cause violence, which could then be blamed on the radicals. So, you know, I always wonder, what's the motivation of somebody like that? And I don't really know. Wendell is long dead, so I can't interview him. In all of his reports to the Justice Department, hundreds of pages, which, as I say, you can look at in the National Archives, there are no fervent expressions of patriotism. I think he just enjoyed playing a role, pretending to be somebody he wasn't, and having a secret that nobody around him knew. That's my speculation. He eventually got outed half a dozen years after this period, and a labor newspaper discovered who he was and published an expose. And then he had a later career as a private detective, running a private detective agency in Detroit, and became a lieutenant colonel in the Michigan State Troops, which were the ancestor of the Michigan National Guard.
This is a time of radical politics, not just in Washington, D.C., but outside Washington, D.C. This is a time of where wobblies obviously were considered a threat. You had the Bolshevik Revolution that was happening in Russia at the time. You had Emma Goldman running around the United States around this period of time. Talk to me about the left in America during World War I.
Well, up until the beginning of the war, the left had been tremendously optimistic. Up until 1914, it had been a time when many people were confident that, you know, all over the world, socialist parties were growing. In many countries, from the United States to Germany, legislatures passed the beginnings of social welfare measures, trying to stay ahead of the socialists, you know, thinking, well, maybe we can steal a march on them if we put in a strong child labor law, something like that. Then, of course, the war was a tremendous disappointment and disillusionment for people with the left everywhere, because they saw how readily millions of people all over the world reverted to feeling their prime loyalty was to their country and not to their cause. The left in the US didn't suffer quite as badly because the United States still stayed out of the war. But come 1917, the US joined the war, and then the government viciously did everything it could to crush the left. The Wobblies, for example, were, you know, the most visible union in the United States. They never comprised more than about 5% of unionized American workers, but they had the best music, they had the best songs, they had the most colorful people, and they were kind of the militant edge of the labor movement. And in the fall of 1917, a couple months after the US entered the war, the government did a sweeping set of raids all around the country, rounding up hundreds and hundreds of Wobblies and put them behind bars. In early 1918, more than 90 of them were found guilty in a single trial in Chicago and sent to prison for collectively a total of more than 800 years if you add up all the sentences given to the group. So that movement was in essence crushed. The Socialist Party was in essence crushed. The Wilson administration got very alarmed when the socialists made strong gains in municipal elections in the fall of 1917. A couple months after the US entered the war, the socialists got more than 20% of the vote in 14 of the country's larger cities, and more than 30% of the vote in several of them, 22% of the vote in New York, for example. And Wilson was horrified because his Democrats controlled the House of Representatives only by a very, very slim margin. And the thought that an anti-war party might gain the balance of power in the midterm elections of 1918 was horrifying to him. And you can find worried correspondence between him and his attorney general and other people. What can we do? Well, what they did was to find excuses to one after another arrest leading socialists and put them in jail. By a year or so later, there were enough, socialist state party chairs, former candidates for the House and Senate and governor in federal prisons around the country that if you had them all in one spot, you could have had a small party Congress. The most famous of those people, of course, was Eugene Debs, who would then run for president 4 times on the socialist ticket. A very gentle, charismatic, warm man, devout Christian, committed to nonviolence, committed to working within the electoral system. He was arrested in 1918, sentenced to 10 years in prison for speaking out against the war. In a fairly mild and vague way, but nonetheless, it was enough to put him behind bars where the government wanted him. And in 1920, he was still in prison when he received more than 900,000 votes on the socialist ticket running for president. 2 years later, the war hysteria had abated. Wilson was no longer in office. Warren Harding was president. And he remitted Deb's sentence, let him out of prison, and invited him to stop in at the White House on his way home. So the two of them had a half-hour chat. We don't know exactly what was said. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in that conversation. And Debs joked to reporters that he had run for the White House 5 times, but this was the first time he'd actually gotten there. Harding did just reduce his sentence to time served, but didn't fully pardon him, which meant that Debs didn't have his citizenship rights restored, such as the right to vote. And a reporter asked him after this visit to the White House, "How do you feel about that, Mr. Debs?" And Debs said, "Well, now I am only a citizen of the world."
Tell me about A. Mitchell Palmer, Attorney General during this time. And you referenced a number of raids and arrests. Is this what was known as Palmer's raids?
Some of them were. Mitchell Palmer was a very ambitious politician. He'd been a Pennsylvania congressman. And he became Wilson's Attorney General towards in the middle of Wilson's second term. And Palmer saw his way to the presidential nomination in 1920. He was very ambitious to become the Democratic candidate for president, and for quite a while, many months, was actually leading the pack. He wanted to run as a law and order candidate. He was, after all, the country's chief law enforcement officer as Attorney General, and he saw the mood of the time was to crush radicals. And in fact, there was some violence that came from the left during this period. In 1919, there were a series of bombings around the country done by a small group of Italian anarchists, the Gallianists, probably no more than 50 in the country as a whole. They were never caught, but today it's believed they were the people who carried out the bombings, one of which was at Palmer's own house. But the government blamed these on the Bolsheviks, the socialists, the left, the IWW, the people that they were anxious to prosecute. So Palmer saw his path to the Democratic nomination as being the law and order candidate. And the Palmer raids were a series of raids around the country, late 1919 and early 1920, which altogether rounded up about 10,000 people who were interrogated, often roughed up, and several thousand of them were kept in prison, jailed, because the government saw them as candidates for deportation. These were people who were foreign born and for one reason or another had never officially become naturalized as American citizens. It was something many people thought not necessary to do at a time when the country seemed to be welcoming immigrants, or they had trouble with the English language and didn't want to go through with the bureaucracy. So thousands of these folks were in prison, scheduled for deportation. Palmer very loudly and publicly deported a whole shipload of them in late 1917. Emma Goldman and her comrade Alexander Berkman were on that ship. And he loudly promised an audience in New York that there would be ship after ship carrying more dangerous radicals out of the country, sailing down the harbor in the near future. That plan got foiled by a very clever bureaucrat named Louis F. Post, who was acting Secretary of Labor. The Justice Department could arrest people, but expulsions, deportations came under the Labor Department because it had the Immigration Bureau. Post was a progressive who had sort of become Secretary of Labor by accident. He was the third ranking person in the department, and the secretary was on leave. The second ranking person left unexpectedly, and Post found himself for about a period of about 6 weeks acting Secretary of Labor, during which time he found legal and bureaucratic means to invalidate thousands of deportation warrants, which made Palmer absolutely furious, as it also infuriated Palmer's deputy, J. Edgar Hoover, who was somebody the country would come to know much better in the next 50 years. But they never really succeeded in getting their mass deportations underway.
Did the threat to democracy, in your view, abate, lessen in the years following the end of World War I? What happened?
I think that the hysteria that I was talking about did die down after 1920 or so. In fact, there's sort of a moment that's a key turning point. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, whom we were talking about, was running hard for the Democratic 1920 presidential nomination. And he repeatedly said that on May 1st, May Day, left-wing holiday, 1920, there was going to be a nationwide communist uprising. And all over the country, Bureau of Investigation agents were on guard in force. The National Guard was on standby. J.P. Morgan hired extra security men. The New York police force called in all 3 shifts. So one shift was on the streets and the other were waiting in station houses. And Palmer promised this is going to be the day when the communists try to take over. Nothing happened. And it kind of took the wind out of Palmer's presidential campaign. He did not get the nomination. And from that point on, you can really see the hysteria abating. However, it had a lot of casualties. It really crushed the left. It crushed the labor movement. Even the very moderate American Federation of Labor lost 1 million members in this period. The labor movement really didn't come back to life in a big way until the 1930s. It wasn't until 1924 that the last political prisoner was released from a federal prison. So yes, we got past it, but at a big cost.
You did pique my interest earlier when you said in the years immediately following the war, people look back at it as a mistake. That hasn't really been the case in my lifetime. I mean, of course, there are some who will look at it as a mistake, but it's oftentimes seen now as another good war that it was good for the United States to get in. Tell me about people looking back early on to this war and seeing it as a mistake.
I think really all over the world in the 1920s, there was a recognition that this war had made the world worse in every conceivable way. It obviously left behind a deeply embittered Germany, and Hitler made use of that bitterness to come to power. It savaged the economies of the countries that had been principally involved in it, England, France, Italy, Russia. It spurred the Russian Revolution, which was something many people had great hopes for at the beginning, but soon turned into a horror show. And I think even in the United States, which had economically prospered from the war and had not lost anywhere near as many soldiers as Europe had, there was a recognition that it may have been a mistake. President Harding said off the record at one point before he let Debs out of jail, he said off the record, and it was only reported after his death, we made a mistake of getting into that war. Debs was right. And many politicians said this, although it wasn't, many politicians felt this way, although it wasn't very politic to say so, because it implied that you no longer wanted to honor war veterans.
Adam Hochschild, thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. It's always a pleasure talking.
Adam Hochschild has been our guest. Again, he is the author of the book, American Midnight, The Great War, A Violent Peace, and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis. This is Letters and Politics on listener-sponsored KPFA in Berkeley, KFCF in Fresno, and KPFK in Los Angeles. I'm Mitch Jeserich. A couple of interesting things there that I never really thought about. One, how people viewed the Great War or World War I in the immediate years afterwards in the 1920s. All my life and growing up, before I got more of a radical education, I always thought of World War I, not so different than World War II in many ways, as it wasn't taught to me as something to be weary of and as a warning, World War I, as a war that people regretted getting into. And it's interesting how this narrative of the Great War still, I would argue, exists all the way up till today. And then the second, I never knew that there was this grand conspiracy just after World War I on May Day, that there was going to be this great communist uprising and all the hysteria that it caused in this country. That was truly fascinating to me. This is Mitch Jeserich, and I am coming to you as we are now in the second week of a very important fall 2022 fund drive. This is the time that I come to you. We try to bring a show that is educational, one that makes you think about things, one that even perhaps get taken away for about an hour or so in the story that we try to unveil through the art of conversation in this hour. And in return, because I said just a moment ago, this is listener-sponsored radio. This is only possible because of your support. It is the listenership that we go to and ask for a donation, one that you can afford, one that is according to your means, and one that you feel good about as you go upon your day. Of course, Adam Hochschild is one of the great men of letters of our time today, co-founder of Mother Jones magazine, wrote such books as King Leopold's Ghost, and now he is out with his brand new book about this World War I Red Scare era called American Midnight. It's what he calls a major threat to democracy. He says democracy was even somewhat wiped away during these war years. We are offering in this book in our fund drive for a pledge of $150 if you're interested in a thank you gift, and if you could do $150. Also, I will add the entire hour-long conversation that I had with Adam Hochschild, one of those interviews that was very difficult to edit down to be able to make it fit in time allotted for today. I will add this video. We'll have a video of it too, but I will add the audio to the Letters and Politics U.S. History Collection. It's online. It's over it's over 80 programs on U.S. history that we have done. We'll add this one to it, and we'll give you access to all 80 of those interviews online with a confirmation email afterwards for a pledge of $100. So that's the Letters and Politics U.S. History Collection, over 80 programs that we have done on U.S. history, $100, or for a pledge of $150, Adam Hochschild's new book, American Midnight is Yours. The phone number for KPFA listeners, there's different phone numbers out here because we are on both in Northern California and Southern California. In Northern California, listening to KPFA, this is also true for KFCF in the Central Valley, the phone number you're going to call is 1-800-439-5732. 1-800-439-5732. And online at kpfa.org. For our friends in Los Angeles listening to KPFK and all through Southern California, the phone number that you're going to call is 818-985-5735. 818-985-5735 and online at kpfk.org. Today is an important day for this radio program to try to meet our $3,000 goal. We have some things that are coming up this week that's going to impede our ability to be able to ask for donations, because we will be doing live coverage that will start during this hour of the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Those hearings are going to begin again this week. We're nearing probably the end of these hearings. This could be one of the last hearings. We will be doing live gavel-to-gavel coverage of that hearing that will impede my ability to try to raise funds in this hour. And so it's important that today, if you appreciate the show that Letters on Politics puts on for you every day, if it's a show that you find a sense of value in, that there is a sense of education in it, that there is a sense of learning, that there is a sense of broadening horizons and I hope deepening your day, because that's the sense I get doing it. Does it translate over to folks who are listening? I don't. You be the judge of that. But that's the experience that I get doing this radio program, and I feel very privileged to be able to do this with you on a daily basis. If you appreciate this program and want to show and if you can show your support, it would be wildly helpful. And if you also appreciate that it will be the people who work on this program, principally Deanna Martinez, myself, the news department, and then help from up front from people like Brian Edwards-Tiekert, that us alone will be putting on this multi-hour live broadcast on Wednesday. That is additional work. It's part of our mission. We're happy to do it. No one's going to get paid more to do it. It's sort of this idea, again, that I try to stress with community radio. It's everyone doing what they can according to what they can. And well, we have enough energy to try to be able to put some extra work to be able to bring in this live broadcast on Wednesday. And so this is what we're doing. This is what we're doing. And I'm hoping that you'll do what you can with a contribution, again, that you can afford, that's according to your means, and one that you'll feel good about. Again, the phone number for KPFA listeners in Northern California, this is also true for Central Valley, 1-800-439-5732, 1-800-439-5732, and online at kpfa.org. In Southern California, listening to KPFK in Los Angeles, that number is 818-985-5735, 818-985-5735, and online at kpfk.org. Today's also an important day for me and this radio program and our efforts to try to raise $3,000, because so far in this drive, this program has been able to keep its own. We had a very large challenge that you may remember that came in on Thursday when we were talking and after we were talking to Yanis Varoufakis. And we actually made that challenge, and that challenge got our average exactly where it needs to be at $3,000. So we're at a good. This is the first time I can come to you at the beginning of the second week of a fund drive and say, "Hey, we're doing okay." But as I was saying, we're going to take a hit on Wednesday because we're going to be doing this live coverage. I'm not going to have the ability to be able to come on during this hour and ask for funds. And you say, well, that's not fair. That's not your fault. And certainly not. However, we still live in we won't be able to go to the people that we owe money for, the electricity and the radio transmitter and all the things that it costs to run a radio station. Say, well, we don't quite have it because we had to do a live broadcast, of the January 6th committee. We had to do that. They're not going to give us a break. So yeah, that's the reality. That's what we're going to do. But it also means right now we can't fall behind at this moment. So far, we're doing pretty good. We made that large challenge, and we have one more challenge today. Somebody who's done this before, because I recognize the name in the city, unless there's several Elizabeths in Los Gatos, who continually has given us large donations and has made it conditional. But I suspect this is the same person, Elizabeth in Los Gatos, who is putting up $1,000 right now. If we can raise that $1,000, that will be $2,000 for us this hour. That would be 2/3 of the way to where we need to be, and it would be good. It would be great. It would be an opportunity for you to double your donation to this radio program and to this radio station right now if we could raise this $1,000 in the next 10 minutes. Again, this is conditional. Elizabeth understands this. She's done this before. She knows that if we can't raise this $1,000, we'll have to offer her that money back. If she takes it back, and I would take it back because I was just looking at our online listening stats. We had a very large audience for that conversation with Adam Hochschild. And I'm not surprised. Adam Hochschild is one of the great writers of our day. And it was great to be able to have him on and have a long conversation with him. That's what your contribution makes possible. It allows us to avoid the sound bites, allows us to be able to take time and space and to really dive into things, because I think it deepens the conversation and deepens at least my knowledge of stuff. I hope perhaps it does the same for you. So yeah, we had a large audience this hour. If we can't meet this $1,000, then who knows if what we're going to be, if this is viable. And that's what this is about. So it's an opportunity for you to double your donation. Again, $25 pledge, $50 pledge, $75 pledge. We ask what you can do. If you're able to do $150, we will send you this brand new book by Adam Hochschild, forgive me, which is about World War I and the Red Scare and the threat to democracy, called American Midnight. Yours for a pledge of $150. He gets into the radical politics and what's going on with the Wobblies and what's going on with the influence of and the response to the Bolshevik Revolution and Russia. This is a fascinating period of time, especially a fascinating period of time for the history of the U.S. left and the global left, really. And Adam Hochschild was the guy who knew how to get right in there and tell that story. That book is yours for a pledge of $150. For a pledge of $100, we'll send you access to the Letters and Politics U.S. History Collection, over 80 programs. So the number again is, for KPFA listeners in Northern California and the Central Valley, 1-800-439-5732. 1-800-439-5732, and online at kpfa.org. At this moment, we have raised $350 towards that $1,000 challenge. We have 6 minutes to make it. KPFA listeners, once again, the number 1-800-439-5732, 1-800-439-5732, and online at kpfa.org. In Southern California, listening to KPFK, folks, friends in Los Angeles, don't hold back. This radio station needs your support. One of the largest radio signals of all the world, especially of this country, especially west of the Mississippi. This is a valuable resource we have, this radio signal that reaches so far. And yet, and believe me, there are a lot of private institutions that would like to gobble it up for themselves. We're asking you to make sure that this stays a part of KPFK, that this stays as a part of the people. The number for KPFK is 818-985-5735, 818-985-5735, and online at kpfk.org. I want to thank Ed in Berkeley and Tanya in San Francisco. A very nice note, Tanya. Thank you. Lee, my friend Lee in Eureka. Thank you so much once again, Lee. Stephen in Oakland. Stephen, thank you for your generosity, as well as to Paul in Emeryville. Thank you, Paul. Rose in Woodacre. Rose, thank you once again. Rose, thank you. Edward in Petaluma as well. Thank you. The number again, folks, for KPFA, and the number of callers we have coming in right now is just one, and we have 5 minutes to raise an additional $700 if we're going to make this $1,000 challenge. The phone number is for KPFA listeners is 1-800-439-5732. 1-800-439-5732. Online at kpfa.org. In Southern California, listening to KPFK in Los Angeles, that number is 818-985-5735. 818-985-5735, and online at kpfk.org. I've said this before, it's a privilege to be able to do this radio program with you every day, Monday through Thursday. It's a privilege, but with that privilege comes a responsibility, and that responsibility is doing our part in helping this radio station raise money in order to keep it on the air, not just this program, but to keep everything that's going on this radio station on the air. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to raise all of it by ourselves, because we're not, because that's not community radio. It's kind of back to the same idea. We need folks who, if you can donate $25, friends, we could use that. If you are somebody with deeper access to income and to financial resources, and you could do $200 or $500 or $1,000, we need that too. We're not going to make it just on $25 contributions alone, and we're not going to make it just on $1,000 contributions alone. What it is everyone doing what they can, and that's why we're asking you for your support. And that goes for this radio program. We're not going to raise all the funds for this radio station, but we need to do our part, considering that we have this great privilege of being on 4 days a week, and considering that we have a pretty nice size audience at the time. We need to make it count. So for KPFA listeners, that phone number once again is 1-800-439-5732. 1-800-439-5732, and online at kpfa.org. In Los Angeles, listening to KPFK, that number is 818-985-5735. 818-985-5735, and online at kpfk.org. Friends, we are now $750 towards that $1,000 challenge. We have 2 minutes to make it, though. And if we can raise that $250 in the next 2 minutes, what that means is that everyone's donation who has come through this hour, because I didn't start really till the end anyways, because I tried to give you the show first. I recognize maybe you've already donated. Maybe you want to take a break once I do see the online listening stats. It really does plummet once I start coming on asking for money. I get it. But before you leave, and maybe you've already done it, that's why I try not to break the show up anymore, because if you've already donated, tomorrow I want you to be able to get the entire show before we pull out to ask for funds, right? I get all that, but that's what we do. We bring this show to you each and every day. And if you haven't made that contribution, well, remember, it's everyone doing their part according to what they can that allows us to be able to continue with this model and bring you the program that you tune in for. For a pledge of $150, American Midnight, the book that we've been in conversation about, is yours. For a pledge of $100, we will send you the Letters on Politics U.S. History collection, over 80 programs on U.S. history. We're going to add today's entire hour-long conversation with Adam Hochschild into that. KPFA listeners, the phone number is 1-800-439-5732, 1-800-439-5732, online at kpfa.org. 1 minute to go, friends. Only 2 people calling in. We need a few more. 1-800-439-5732. 1-800-439-5732. Online at kpfa.org. In Los Angeles, that number is 818-985-5735. 818-985-5735. Online at kpfk.org. Evelyn and El Cerrito, thank you very much for your generosity and your nice note. Ann and Point Reyes, thank you. And here we go, folks. We are down to just 2 people calling, still waiting to see if we're going to make this challenge or not. For KPFA, 1-800-439-5732, 1-800-439-5732, online at kpfa.org. In Los Angeles, 818-985-5735, 818-985-5735, online at kpfk.org. 2 people calling in. We haven't made the challenge yet. We have about